The sun hung low over the dusty plains, spilling long streaks of gold across the quiet town of Meadowbrook. The train tracks shimmered faintly in the heat, stretching toward the horizon like two endless threads leading to another world. Elias Ward stood near the platform, hat in hand, his jaw tight, his boots scuffed from pacing. He had worked dawn till dusk all week, hoping hard labor would numb the ache he felt inside, but nothing could dull the sting of watching Clara Dane leave. Clara was standing by the train, her small gloved hands trembling as she clutched a worn leather case. The brim of her bonnet shaded her face, but Elias could still see her eyes, clear gray like the morning sky before rain. She looked at him with a mix of love and fear, her lips parting as if to speak, then pressing shut again. Behind her, her father, Judge Henry Dane, stood stiff as a post, his disapproving gaze fixed squarely on Elias. "You should go," the judge had said earlier that morning, his voice cold as iron. "My daughter deserves a life of refinement, not one spent shoveling hay and patching fences." Elias had no answer. He was a rancher, born and raised on the hard soil of Texas. His hands were rough, his words plain, his fortune modest. But his heart had always belonged to Clara. They'd met 2 summers ago when she first came to teach at the little schoolhouse by the river. He'd fallen for her laughter, her wit, the way she read poetry under the willow trees as if every word were a secret she wanted to share with him. Now that same willow tree might as well have withered, for everything they'd built beneath its shade was crumbling. The train's whistle blew, a long, mournful cry that seemed to pierce Elias straight through. He took a step forward, his voice breaking as he said, "Clara, you don't have to do this. You know I'll take care of you. I'll build us a home." Her eyes shimmered with tears. "You already have, Elias," she whispered. "You built it here." She touched her chest lightly. "But my father won't listen. He says you'll only hold me back. And I can't," her voice cracked. "I can't fight him anymore." Elias wanted to pull her into his arms, to defy her father, to run away together as he'd dreamed so many nights before. But the platform was crowded with townsfolk and travelers, and the judge's shadow loomed between them like a wall. Clara hesitated, her fingers twitching as though they longed to reach for him. Then in a swift, trembling motion, she pressed a folded letter into his hand. "Promise me you'll read this," she said. "And that you'll write." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I will. Every week, I swear it." The train let out another shrill whistle, steam curling around them like a ghost. Clara's father took her arm. She turned back once more, her face pale and tear-streaked, and whispered the words Elias would remember for years to come. "Wait for me." Then she stepped onto the train. The wheels groaned. Metal clashed, and the great engine began to move. Elias stood rooted to the platform, the letter clenched in his hand, watching as the train carried her farther and farther away, until her face was nothing but a blur in the window, and finally only smoke and silence remained. When the last echo of the whistle faded, Elias put on his hat and turned toward the empty plains. The world felt hollow. He had lost her, at least for now. But deep down he made a silent vow. He would wait as long as it took. Because if love was real, he told himself, no distance or father's wrath could truly end it. The first few days after Clara's departure passed in a haze of disbelief. Elias Ward woke before dawn each morning, as he always did, tending to the horses and mending fences on his ranch. But now the world felt quieter, emptier. The sound of the wind in the grass reminded him of her laughter. Even the sunlight seemed dimmer without her walking beside him on the ridge. Every evening after supper, he'd sit by the lamp in his small cabin and unfold her letter, the one she had pressed into his hand at the station. Her words were neat and careful, written with the same grace she carried in her speech. "No matter what happens," she had written, "believe that I love you and I will write again soon." And so, Elias waited. He rode to town twice a week, his boots heavy with dust, and stopped by the telegraph office where the post arrived. The clerk, an old man named Mr. Whitby, soon recognized him by sight. Each time Elias stepped inside, the man would shake his head apologetically before Elias even spoke. "No letter today, son." Elias would nod, tip his hat, and walk out with a hollow feeling that sank deeper each time. The first letter he sent her was filled with hope. He told her of the spring rains, how the pastures were turning green again, and how he'd repaired the fence by the creek she used to love. He ended the letter simply, I'll be here when you're ready to come home. Weeks passed. No reply. He wrote again, then again. By the third letter, his words had grown uncertain. Maybe your father's still keeping us apart, he wrote. But I'll keep trying. He mailed each one with care, even paying extra for special post, imagining how her hands would unfold them with that familiar smile. But the mailbox stayed empty. Summer deepened into autumn, and rumors began to drift through Meadowbrook like dust on the wind. Someone claimed they'd seen a notice in a city paper that Judge Dane's daughter had become engaged to a wealthy merchant from back east. Another said they'd heard she was teaching in a fine school, too proud to remember the man who'd once promised her a cabin and a handful of stars. Elias refused to believe it. He tore up the gossip like he'd tear up thorns from his fields. Still, the seed of doubt took root in his heart, growing quietly in the shadows. At night he'd sit by the fire, her letter spread across his knees, the ink fading at the edges from how often he'd read it. Sometimes he'd imagine her voice, soft, reassuring, saying his name. Other times he'd dream of her stepping off a train, smiling through tears, running into his arms. But each morning he woke alone. By winter, hope began to waver. The nights grew longer and colder. Snow fell thick across the plains, covering everything in white silence. Elias stopped writing after his sixth letter. He still rode to town, though, out of habit. Out of the stubborn faith that maybe, just maybe, something had gone wrong with the post and her words would still find him. They never did. When spring came, Elias buried her last letter beneath the willow tree where they'd shared their first kiss. He couldn't bring himself to burn it. Instead, he sealed it in a tin box and buried it deep, whispering, "If you ever find your way back, Clara, I'll still be here." From that day on, Elias spoke little of her name. But his eyes carried a far-away look, and people in town learned not to mention the woman who'd left on the train. They said time would heal him, but Elias knew better. Time only teaches you to live with the ache. It never takes it away. The years rolled on like a slow river, carving silence into Elias Ward's life. After Clara's letters stopped coming, he learned to speak less and work more. The ranch became his whole world, his cattle, his fences, his land. He mended what was broken, but inside he never mended himself. When word spread that war had broken out back east, Meadowbrook changed overnight. The town's young men, boys Elias had seen grow up chasing tumbleweeds, lined up at the depot, eager to enlist. Some said it was their duty. Others saw it as adventure. Elias watched them go with a heavy heart, remembering another day, another train, and the woman he'd lost to its whistle. His younger brother, Caleb, was among the first to volunteer. "Don't look at me like that, Eli," Caleb said, adjusting his new uniform with a shaky grin. "Somebody's got to stand up for something. Maybe I'll come back a hero." Elias tried to smile. "Just come back alive." He clasped Caleb's shoulder, and for a moment the brothers stood silent, their bond stronger than words. When the train pulled away, Elias lifted his hat in farewell the same way he had years ago when Clara left. He didn't realize until later how much those two goodbyes would haunt him. The war dragged on. Letters arrived from Caleb, brief, smudged, and brave. He wrote of muddy camps, endless marches, and how he'd met men from every corner of the country. He told Elias not to worry, that he'd be home before the leaves turned gold again. But the leaves fell twice, and no more letters came. When the telegram arrived, Elias didn't need to read the words to know. He stared at the folded paper for a long time before opening it. Private Caleb Ward, killed in action. That was all. 6 words. 6 words that emptied the world of sound. The following days passed in silence. Elias buried the telegram beside the willow tree near Clara's letter. He didn't cry, not in front of anyone. But that night under the stars, he fell to his knees in the cold grass and finally let the grief come. The sky swallowed his cries, and when dawn came, he rose again. Older, harder, quieter. The town looked to him after that. The sheriff asked him to oversee livestock drives. The church asked for donations to help the widows. Elias never said no. He became a man of few words but steady hands, someone others could rely on. The schoolhouse stood empty now. Clara's replacement had left long ago, unable to stand the loneliness of the plains. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Elias would ride past it. The windows were boarded, but once, he thought he saw the faint outline of her handwriting still etched into the chalkboard, a half-erased line of poetry she'd written for her students. Though the heart may wander, it always remembers home. Those words stayed with him. Years passed, and though the world beyond Meadowbrook changed, new roads, new faces, the distant sound of progress, Elias remained the same. The townsfolk whispered that he'd become a ghost of himself, living only for the land and the memory of those he'd lost. Yet inside a small ember still burned, the memory of gray eyes and a promise whispered through tears. Wait for me. One evening, as Elias sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the ridge, a faint sound stirred the air, the far-off wail of a train whistle. He froze, heart hammering. It had been years since one passed through at that hour. For a brief moment he could almost see her again, stepping down onto the platform, the wind tugging at her hat, her eyes searching for him. He blinked, and the vision faded. The plains were empty, only the whistle remained, echoing across the valley before fading into silence. Still, for the first time in years, Elias whispered aloud to the empty horizon, maybe someday. He didn't know then that someday was closer than he thought it was early autumn when the quiet town of Meadowbrook stirred with whispers again. The leaves had just begun to turn gold and the air carried the crisp scent of harvest. Elias Ward was in the corral repairing a broken gate when a rider galloped in from town with news that would soon shake the dust off the sleepy settlement. The noon train's coming through with passengers, war widows and orphans, the rider called. They're stopping here for supplies and rest. Elias paused, resting his hammer against the fence post. Trains rarely stopped in Meadowbrook anymore. The line had been rerouted years ago, leaving the old platform quiet, its benches cracked and its sign half faded. But the thought of a train full of travelers, especially those touched by war, stirred something in him. He had lived through the war's echoes in his own way. The loss of his brother, the emptiness of letters never received. Those were wounds no one could see. So, when the townsfolk gathered supplies for the passengers, blankets, food, spare clothes, Elias volunteered without hesitation. He loaded his wagon with sacks of potatoes, a few blankets, and a jug of cider. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. As he drove toward the station, the sound of the wind in the tall grass reminded him again of voices long gone, Caleb's laughter, Clara's gentle song. By the time Elias arrived, the station was alive with movement. Children peered from behind skirts, clutching rag dolls. Women in worn coats stepped carefully onto the platform, their faces pale, their eyes tired from too many goodbyes. The air was thick with steam and the scent of coal. Elias kept his hat low as he handed out food and helped lift bags. He had no interest in small talk. He was there to do what needed doing. But as he worked, something began to tug at his memory. A faint sound, a soft laugh, almost like a song carried by the wind. He froze, heart skipping. It couldn't be. The whistle blew again, sharp and mournful. The crowd shifted as more passengers stepped down. Through the veil of steam, Elias saw her. A woman in a simple blue dress and a faded straw hat stood at the far end of the platform, holding the hand of a small girl. Her posture was weary, but there was grace in the way she stood, something familiar that struck Elias like lightning. He blinked, his breath catching. No, it can't be her. She turned her face slightly and his world stopped. It was Clara. Her face was thinner, her skin paler, but those gray eyes, those eyes he had memorized, were the same. They met his for the briefest second, full of disbelief and something deeper, fear, perhaps, or hope. Elias felt the air leave his chest. Every letter, every lonely year, every prayer beneath that willow tree came rushing back. He wanted to run to her, to call her name, but his boots felt nailed to the ground. She blinked as if uncertain he was real, then looked away quickly, focusing on the child beside her. "Ma'am, need help with your luggage?" the station clerk asked kindly. Clara nodded, her voice trembling. "Thank you, sir." Just one trunk, that voice, it was her. Elias knew it down to his soul. He took a step forward, but the crowd shifted again, blocking his view. When it cleared, she was walking toward the edge of town with the little girl, her blue dress fluttering in the autumn breeze. For a long moment, Elias stood frozen. The years of silence, the pain, the waiting, they had led to this impossible moment. Clara was alive. She had come back, not as he remembered her, but changed, wiser, worn, and carrying secrets in her eyes. He touched the brim of his hat, whispering her name like a prayer. "Clara." The wind carried it away, but he knew this was no dream. The train had brought her back, and though he didn't yet understand why or how, one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. The afternoon sun hung low over Meadowbrook, painting the old train station in amber light. Dust swirled through the air, carried by the faint wind that came down from the hills. The crowd that had gathered to greet the incoming passengers had begun to thin, wagons rolling away, mothers calling for children, and storekeepers heading back to their shops. But Elias Ward remained where he stood, by the post at the far end of the platform, eyes fixed on the train that still hissed and rumbled, as if breathing after a long journey. He could barely think. His pulse hammered like a drum in his ears. After all these years, after the silence, the waiting, the heartbreak, Clara was there. Not a dream, not a memory. Her. Steam rose from beneath the great iron wheels, curling around his boots as if daring him to move. But Elias couldn't. It was as if time itself had frozen. He watched her carefully now. Clara stood near the far bench with the small girl he'd seen earlier. The child, perhaps 6 or 7, clung to her skirt, wide-eyed and quiet. Clara knelt, brushing the child's hair back with a tenderness that made Elias's chest tighten. Her hands were the same, delicate but strong. The same hands that had once patched his torn shirt by lantern light and held his face as she promised to write. A station worker passed by, tipping his hat politely to her. "Ma'am, the hotel's just down the road if you need a place for the night." Clara smiled faintly, her voice soft. "Thank you. We'll rest here for a bit." The sound of her voice, gentle, musical, trembling at the edges, brought Elias back to the years that had nearly buried him. He had dreamed of that voice in the silence of winter, heard it in the rustle of the willows by the creek, and now it was real again. The train whistle blew loud and sharp. The sound cut through the air like a blade, and in that moment Clara looked up. Their eyes met. Elias's breath caught. Her gaze wavered, confusion flickering there first, then shock, and finally something he could only describe as disbelief and longing tangled together. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. The world around them blurred, the hiss of steam, the shuffle of feet, the chatter of travelers, until only the two of them existed, bound by the ghosts of everything unsaid. Then, as suddenly as it came, the moment broke. Clara looked away, clutching the child's hand tighter. She rose, guiding the girl toward a bench at the far end of the platform. Elias could see her shoulders trembling, could see how she tried to steady herself. The way she moved told him she had endured much, more than he could yet understand. He wanted to go to her, to call her name, to demand an explanation for all those silent years. But something stopped him. Fear, perhaps, or respect for the pain etched in her face. Instead, he stepped back, heart thudding painfully, and tipped his hat in her direction. If she saw, she gave no sign. The whistle blew again, a final mournful sound that carried down the valley and into the plains. The great engine shuddered, then began to pull away, leaving behind the lingering echo of metal and steam. Elias watched until the last car vanished into the horizon. Only then did he turn away, his hands shaking. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, how he'd smile, how she'd run into his arms, how the years apart would melt away like morning frost. But this reunion was different. There had been no embrace, no joy, only silence, heavy and uncertain. And yet beneath that silence, Elias felt something stir, a fragile thread of hope. She was alive. That was enough for now. As he walked back toward his wagon, the fading whistle echoed through the hills, haunting and beautiful. Elias glanced back one last time at the platform where she stood, her figure outlined by the sinking sun. He didn't know why fate had brought her back. But deep down, he sensed this was only the beginning of the story that had never truly ended. For the rest of that day, Elias Ward worked like a man possessed, if only to keep from thinking. But no amount of mending fences or splitting logs could quiet the pounding in his chest. Clara Dane. After all these years, she was real, not a ghost of memory. He had seen her, her eyes, her face, her trembling hands. And that child, the little girl who clung to her side, who was she? That night sleep refused to come. The wind howled through the shutters, carrying with it the faint sound of the train's departing whistle. Elias sat by the dying fire, running a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of it all. He told himself he should stay away, that whatever had passed between them was long dead. but his heart argued otherwise. He needed to see her again, if only to know the truth. At sunrise, he saddled his horse and rode into town. The station platform was empty now, only the faint tracks of wagon wheels and boot prints marking the dirt. He asked around quietly, careful not to draw attention. It didn't take long before Mrs. Ashby, who ran the boarding house, mentioned a new guest. She came in last night with a child, Mrs. Ashby said, wiping her hands on her apron. Said she'd just come west from St. Louis. Poor thing, looks like she's seen more sorrow than a soul should. Her name's Mrs. Dane. Elias's heart gave a hard, painful jolt. Mrs. Dane. He thanked her, trying to keep his voice steady, and walked down the narrow path toward the boarding house. The front porch creaked beneath his boots. Through the open window he could hear a child humming softly, an old lullaby he half remembered Clara singing years ago. When she taught the children in town, he stood there, frozen, torn between walking in and turning away. But before he could decide, the door opened. Clara stepped out, carrying a small basin of water. When she saw him, the basin slipped from her hands, water splashing across the wooden steps. For a long, trembling moment, neither of them spoke. Elias, she whispered finally, his name trembling on her lips like a prayer. He removed his hat, his throat tight. Clara. She looked smaller somehow, frailer. The brightness that once lived in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a quiet sorrow. Her dress was clean but worn, her hands marked by the kind of labor life in the city seldom demanded. Yet beneath it all, she was still her, the same woman he'd waited for, the same soul that had haunted his every lonely night. I didn't expect you'd still be here, she said softly, her voice breaking. I never left, he answered simply. The wind stirred between them, carrying with it the scent of dust and memory. Clara's gaze dropped to the ground. I thought... She paused, gathering her breath. I thought you'd moved on, that you'd hate me for leaving. Elias shook his head slowly. I never could. The little girl appeared in the doorway then, clutching a small doll made of cloth. Her wide eyes flicked between the two adults. Mama? She asked shyly. Clara's expression changed, softened into something motherly and protective. Go back inside, sweetheart. I'll be there soon. When the girl disappeared, Elias frowned gently. Your daughter? A shadow crossed Clara's face. No, she said after a pause. My sister's. She didn't survive the war. Her voice trembled at the last word. Elias said nothing. He only nodded, though 1,000 questions burned behind his calm exterior. Clara looked at him again, tears glimmering. Elias, I need to explain everything. Why I never wrote, why I... He held up a hand, stopping her gently. Not here, he said quietly. Come by the ranch tomorrow. We'll talk then. She hesitated, then nodded. As Elias walked away, the sun rose higher, washing the town in gold. For the first time in years, he felt the faint pulse of something he thought long dead. Hope. He didn't know what the truth would bring. Pain, forgiveness, or both. But he knew one thing for certain. Clara Dane was back in his world, and nothing in Meadowbrook would ever be the same again. The next morning dawned cold and quiet, the kind of morning where the sky seemed to hold its breath. Elias Ward stood by the barn, his hands restless as he checked the horses' harnesses for the 3rd time. He wasn't expecting a normal day. He'd barely slept, his thoughts circling endlessly around one truth. Clara was alive, and today she was coming to explain the years of silence that had nearly destroyed him. He told himself he was ready. But when he saw her walking up the dirt road toward the ranch, blue dress fluttering in the breeze, the little girl beside her clutching a small wicker basket, his chest tightened all over again. Clara paused at the gate, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Elias met her halfway, his steps slow but steady. Mornin', Clara, he said quietly. Elias, she breathed, her voice soft and careful, as though afraid her words might break the fragile peace between them. He gestured toward the porch. Come inside. You both look like you could use some rest. They sat at the wooden table where Elias had eaten in silence for years. The girl, little Lily, Clara had called her, nibbled shyly at a biscuit while Clara wrapped her hands around a cup of coffee, her fingers trembling slightly. Elias waited. He wasn't a man of many words, but his silence often spoke louder than speech. Finally, Clara set the cup down and met his gaze. You deserve the truth, Elias, all of it. He nodded once. She took a breath. When I left Meadowbrook, I meant every word I said. I loved you and I planned to come back. But my father, she hesitated, swallowing hard. He found out you'd written. He took your letters before I could see them. Every one of them. Elias's jaw tightened. All of them? She nodded, eyes glistening. He said you'd moved on. That you'd stopped writing because you'd found someone else. He showed me a forged letter, said it came from you. I believed him for a while. I was so young and so afraid. Elias turned his hat in his hands, struggling to contain the storm inside him. And the man you married? Her lips pressed into a thin line. My father arranged it. A man of means, a merchant from St. Louis. I didn't love him, but I thought it was what my father wanted. The war came soon after. My husband enlisted and I followed him to the camps as a nurse. Her voice trembled now. He died 2 years later in one of the last battles. I stayed on, helping where I could. That's when I found Lily. She's my sister's child. My sister and her husband both fell ill during the winter. I promised I'd take care of her. Elias leaned back, the pain in his chest shifting to something quieter. Sorrow more than anger. You've had a hard road, Clara. So have you, she whispered. I heard about Caleb. I'm sorry, Elias, truly. He nodded, eyes distant. The mention of his brother reopened old wounds, but he didn't flinch. War takes too much from everyone. For a long moment, silence filled the room, soft, heavy, and strangely peaceful. The years apart hung between them like fog, but now it began to clear. Finally, Clara reached across the table, her hand trembling as it brushed his. I never stopped thinking of you, not once. I used to dream of this place, of you, wondering if you'd still be here. Elias's rough hand closed gently over hers. I waited, Clara. I didn't know why you stopped writing, but I never stopped hoping. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Then maybe there's still something left to mend, she whispered. He didn't answer right away. He only looked at her, really looked, and saw not the girl he'd lost, but the woman who'd survived everything life had thrown at her. Outside, the wind stirred the willows by the creek, the same trees beneath which they'd once dreamed of forever. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew that perhaps, against all odds, forever wasn't gone. It had simply been waiting for the right time to return. The days that followed their reunion were quiet, heavy with unspoken feelings and cautious steps. Clara and little Lily stayed in town at Mrs. Ashby's boarding house while Elias returned to his daily chores on the ranch. But nothing felt the same anymore. Every sunrise, every whisper of wind through the cottonwoods reminded him of the years that had been stolen from them. He tried to tell himself not to hope too much. Life had changed her and him as well. The easy laughter they once shared had been replaced by long silences filled with what-ifs and half-healed hurts. Yet beneath it all, something fragile and alive stirred between them, a second chance neither dared name aloud. One afternoon, Elias hitched up his wagon and drove into town with a few bags of flour and apples to sell. When he saw Clara standing by the schoolyard fence, helping Lily tie her bonnet, he stopped in the middle of the road and just watched for a moment. The sight of her, gentle, patient, smiling despite the weight of her past, was like seeing spring bloom after a long, merciless winter. She noticed him and smiled shyly. You've been avoiding me, she teased softly as he approached. Just been working, Elias replied, though his voice betrayed him. Working, she repeated with a faint grin. Always your excuse. For a brief golden moment it felt as though the years between them had vanished. He wanted to say everything, the anger he'd buried, the longing he'd carried, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he cleared his voice. If you and Lily ever need a place to stay, the ranch has room. I built a small cabin out back a few winters ago. It's quiet, safe. Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening on the fence rail. You'd really want us there? After everything. He met her eyes, steady and sure. After everything, he said simply. Her gaze softened, but there was still a shadow behind her smile. I don't want to be a burden, Elias. You've built a life here. I wouldn't want to reopen old wounds. Elias looked away, jaw tense. Some wounds never really close. But maybe they heal better when you stop running from them. The wind picked up then, lifting a strand of her hair across her face. Without thinking, Elias reached out, gently brushing it aside. His fingers lingered for the briefest heartbeat before he drew back, as if the touch had burned him. She looked up at him, eyes shimmering. You haven't changed much, she whispered. Maybe not enough, he murmured. They stood like that for a long while, saying nothing, the world around them falling still except for the rustle of autumn leaves. Over the next few days, Clara and Lily began visiting the ranch more often. Lily followed Elias everywhere, laughing as she chased the barn cats or tried to feed the horses apples that were nearly as big as her hands. The sound of her laughter filled the empty spaces in Elias's heart he hadn't realized were still hollow. Clara helped him in the kitchen, mending curtains, baking bread, humming softly as she worked. It was simple, ordinary life, but to Elias it felt like a kind of miracle. Still, beneath the warmth there was tension. Sometimes he caught her staring out at the horizon, eyes clouded with worry, as though afraid this peace was only temporary. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Elias found her standing by the willow tree. "You're thinking about leaving again," he said quietly. Clara's breath caught. "I'm afraid, Elias. Afraid this is just a moment borrowed from the past, that when the world remembers me, it'll take it back." He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "You're not running anymore." "Not from me, not from this place." Her eyes met his, tears glinting. "And if I hurt you again?" Elias reached out, gently taking her hand. "Then I'll forgive you again." The silence that followed was full, not empty. The air smelled of rain and earth, the same scent that had once surrounded their first kiss under that same tree. For the first time since her return, Clara smiled through her tears. And in that moment, both of them knew that though scars remained, something new, something steady and tender, was beginning to grow in their place. The following week brought restless nights and uneasy hearts. For all the quiet peace that had begun to return to Elias Ward's ranch, something still hung in the air, unfinished, unspoken. Clara could feel it every time she saw the way Elias looked at her, that mixture of longing and restraint. He wanted to believe in her again, but the wound of their past stood like a ghost between them. She had told him much, but not everything. There were truths she had buried, painful ones she'd been too afraid to bring into the light. Now she knew she could not carry them any longer. If they were ever to have a future, it had to begin with honesty. That evening, clouds gathered low over the valley. A storm was coming. The train that passed through town once a week was due soon, the same train that had brought her back into Elias's life. Clara stood at the edge of the platform, her coat drawn tight around her. The whistle was still distant, but she could already hear it, that familiar aching sound that once symbolized endings. This time it felt like a choice. She had written a letter for Elias, one that explained everything she had been too afraid to say aloud. She thought perhaps she would leave it with Mrs. Ashby and go quietly, sparing him the pain of reopening old scars. But fate, it seemed, was not done with them. Behind her, heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden boards. Clara turned, and there he was. Elias, his hat pulled low, his face unreadable but his eyes burning with quiet desperation. Leaving again. His voice was rough but not angry. "Just tired," Clara's breath caught. "I thought maybe it'd be easier if I did." He stepped closer, rain beginning to patter against the brim of his hat. "Easier for who?" Her fingers tightened around the letter in her hand. "For you. For Lily. You deserve peace, Elias. You've already lost too much." "Don't tell me what I deserve," he said softly, taking another step. "You left once and I nearly lost myself waiting for you. If you walk away again, I won't stop you. But you don't get to decide what I can or can't live with." The whistle blew then, long, sharp, echoing through the storm. Clara flinched, blinking back tears. "Elias," she whispered, "there's something you need to know before I decide anything." She pressed the folded letter into his hand. "I wasn't just kept from you by my father or by the war. When my husband died, I found out I was expecting." Elias froze, his heart stuttering. "You had a child?" Her voice trembled. "A son. He didn't survive the winter. Fever took him before he could walk." Tears streamed freely now, her body shaking with grief long kept buried. "I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I was afraid you'd see me as ruined, broken. I didn't want your pity." Elias stood silent, the rain soaking through his coat. Slowly he reached out and took her trembling hand. "Clara," he said hoarsely, "I don't pity you. I grieve with you." She looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. "After everything, after all I hid?" He nodded. "You think I haven't lived with ghosts too? We both lost pieces of ourselves. But we're still here." The train hissed, preparing to depart. Clara turned toward it, torn between past and future. Elias stepped closer, his voice low and steady over the sound of the storm. I don't care where you've been, Clara. I only care that you came back. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then with a trembling breath, she let the letter slip from her hand. It fluttered to the wet boards and was carried off by the wind. The train began to pull away. Clara turned back to Elias, tears and rain mingling on her face. I came back because I never stopped loving you, she said. And as the whistle faded into the distance, Elias took her into his arms. The years of distance, the pain, the silence, all of it washed away beneath the rain. He held her close, whispering against her hair. Then don't leave again. Not ever. And she didn't. The storm passed during the night, leaving the air washed clean and soft. Morning sunlight filtered through the clouds in golden streams that danced across the wet fields. Elias Ward stood on the porch, his hat in hand, watching the light spill over the land he had tended for years. For the first time in so long, it didn't feel empty. There was laughter inside the house, Lily's bright, bubbling giggle followed by Clara's gentle voice, humming a tune he hadn't heard since before the war. The sound stirred something deep in his chest, something he hadn't dared to name in years. Peace. Clara stepped out onto the porch, her hair still damp from washing, her eyes softer now that the weight of her secret had been laid to rest. She leaned against the railing beside him. For a long while they just stood there, looking out across the valley that had seen all their heartbreak, and now perhaps their healing. I keep thinking I'll wake up, she said quietly, that all this will vanish and I'll be back at the station again, watching the train disappear instead of stepping off it. Elias smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You're here now, Clara. The train's gone and you stayed. She looked at him then, really looked. The strong lines of his face, the silver at his temples, the steady kindness in his eyes. He had weathered life the way the mountains weathered storms, silent, scarred, but still standing. I don't know what I deserve anymore, she whispered. He turned to her. You deserve this. A home. Peace. Love that doesn't demand you earn it. Her eyes glistened. And you? What do you deserve? Elias gave a quiet laugh. I reckon I've already got it. She smiled through her tears, and for a heartbeat, the world stilled. Later that afternoon, Lily came running from the barn, clutching a tiny bouquet of wildflowers. For you, Mama, she chirped, handing them to Clara. Then she turned to Elias with a grin. And for you, Mr. Ward, 'cause Mama says you're our good neighbor. Elias crouched, accepting the flowers solemnly. Neighbor, huh? Well, I suppose I can live with that for now. Clara laughed, the sound light and musical. She's still getting used to the idea, she said, brushing Lily's hair back from her face. Elias met her eyes. And you? Her laughter faded into something quieter, more tender. I'm still getting used to it too, she admitted. But I think I'd like to stay, if you'll have us. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they'd lost and everything they still hoped to build. Elias reached out, his rough hand finding hers. Clara, he said softly, you never had to ask. The wind rustled through the willow trees, the same ones beneath which they had once carved their initials as foolish young lovers. The carving was faint now, worn down by time, but still visible, proof that some things, even when weathered, endure that evening. As dusk settled over the valley, they sat by the fire with Lily curled between them. Clara read aloud from an old book, her voice calm and steady, while Elias listened, one arm draped protectively around them both. Outside, crickets sang and the scent of rain lingered in the air. When Lily finally fell asleep, Elias turned to Clara. The firelight played across her face, softening every line of worry that had haunted her since her return. I thought I'd lost you forever, he said quietly. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. You did lose me, Elias, but you found me again and I'm not running anymore. He drew her close, their foreheads touching, the silence between them full of all the words they no longer needed to speak. In that moment, the past no longer mattered. The pain, the loss, the years, they were no longer chains, but threads that had led them here to this promise, that love, real love, endures even through silence, through war, through time itself. Outside, the train whistle sounded faintly in the distance, a reminder of endings and beginnings. But this time neither of them flinched. They simply held each other tighter, knowing that for the first time in a long, long while, they were finally home.